Okay, everyone, it is noon, so we will go ahead and get started with our presentation today. My name is Haley Rossi Young, and I am the Secretary Treasurer for APA's Division 18 Community and State Hospitals section, and we are excited to host Mr. Ron Unger for the second in his series of three webinars on trauma and psychosis for us today. Mr. Unger comes as an expert in the topic, having taught on the material, have provided clinical services to many members of the population, and actively blogging on his website, and being a member of the U.S. chapter of the ISPS. So we are thrilled to have him today. We are recording this webinar. It will be posted on our YouTube account for later viewing, and the link will go out in the email to all of the registrants for this meeting. I have also dropped in the chat links to our post-webinar feedback survey, and I will be moderating the chat for Mr. Unger today. So if you have any questions that come up, you can drop them in the Q&A or in the participant chat, and I will pass those along during our Q&A section at the end of our presentation. So if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen, Ron, we will get started.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for showing up and for your interest. So one key idea I'm going to be focusing on today is how people who experience trauma and then psychosis often lose their sense of having a coherent story, and how regaining some kind of coherent story can be vital to recovery. And before I look at how we might help people rebuild their story, I want to look at, what gets in the way of having a coherent story in the first place. And just to get you thinking, one thing I want to look at is how maybe in some of the ways the mental health system often explains things are not that helpful. So, so this slide looks at kind of like what happens when somebody asks, hey, what's causing these weird experiences? And often the answer they get is, well, they're caused by your illness, which is schizophrenia. But then if anyone kind of like ever asks, well, how do you know I have an illness called schizophrenia? Really, the only answer we have is, well, we can diagnose you with schizophrenia because you have these weird experiences. We seem to be giving an answer about what caused the problem, but we aren't really adding any useful information. It's as though somebody came in with high blood pressure and asked what was causing the high blood pressure, and we said, well, it's your hypertension. Now, it is true that many involved, including the diagnosed person, may at first feel relieved when they're given a fancy label and told that that explains the problem. Some people, for example, might feel a sense of relief from having to think that maybe anything that they did or that was done to the person caused the mental troubles or kept them going. But a big problem with that kind of non-answer is it deflects attention away from thinking about all the factors that might actually be involved that could be identified and could help the person have more of a sense of control. Whether it's, psychosis or hypertension, there's often a lot of factors that play into it that could be identified and give the person a sense of control if they have a sense of what they are and what they could do about it. And we want to get people beyond feeling like they're the passive victim of an active illness, or beyond thinking that the only thing they can do about the problem is take a pill. Also, the more the problem is seen in terms of a big word like schizophrenia or mysterious illness, the harder it is to imagine a recovery story. Now, one great summary of how taking a diagnosis as an explanation can seem to help, but then cause more problems, and also about what really helps, is told in a short 10-minute video that Ray Waddingham put together called Becoming a Person. And she tells how she was abused as a child, and as a result, she felt either that she was an alien or she had an alien inside her. And at some point, that became a really huge thing and took over her life. Then she went to the psychiatrist who told her, no, you're not an alien and don't have an alien inside you. You just have schizophrenia. And at first that seemed really helpful because it explained how she felt different in a way that wasn't as scary as the alien story. And the problem is, though, that it's left her still feeling helpless and hopelessly different from regular people. So she was really still alienated or alien from others. And what did eventually help was friends and family and peers and hearing voices groups who stayed curious about both her history, what happened to her, and how she reacted, and what her possible future might be. They kept asking curious questions. And at first she had no answers, but then she got curious herself, and eventually she started seeing at least embers of a possible future. And that inspired her to go back to trying things, getting more peer support, engaging in music and art. And as she did, her sense of a possible future became stronger. As she put it, she was no longer a ball of blackness. Instead, the black was just a shadow of the things that had happened to her. And now she's married and a mom and a leader in the mental health field. Now, like most people who recover, she did take lots of time to do so. And especially those of you who work in brief stay hospitals might be wondering, well, what can I do about that kind of journey? But a key thing I think is talking about things in a way that sparks some curiosity that later pays off for the person. Now, Eleanor Longden is another person who's very well known in the recovery movement now, but for many years she was severely troubled and impaired. Now, one thing that really helped her so much that she still often repeats the story was just a brief bit of work she did with a psychiatrist named Pat Bracken. And she went into his office and he asked her to tell him about herself. And she just said, well, my name's Eleanor and I'm a schizophrenic. And his reply was, I don't want to hear what others have said about you. I want to hear about you. And he showed really an interest in who she was as a person. And that simple curiosity about her really got her going in a better direction. And eventually, she was able to see that what had happened to her was that she'd gotten abused, and then she tried to bury it. But unfortunately, as she put it, she buried it alive, and it came back in the form of voices. And then some professionals convinced her she had to try to suppress or eliminate the voices, but that didn't work and made things worse. And it wasn't until she became curious about her experiences and the emotions and memories behind the voices that she was able to heal. But again, it starts with that simple curiosity and that maybe there's a story here. There is a worldwide movement now pushing to shift the questions we ask people from what's wrong with you to, well, what happened to you and what sense did you make of it? That's asking for a story and putting things into context. And I would say just the switch to what happened to you isn't enough. However, because, if, what's wrong is just what happened to you and you can't change the past, that still leaves you kind of disempowered and stuck. So I think it's good to ask, well, what's happening with you right now? How are you making sense of things right now? Because the present is different than the past. We can start shifting how we handle things. And what would you like to see happen in the future? And what do you see you could possibly do to bring that about? There's a real key thing is to help people again have a sense of a future, that they can regain some personal power and go on with their life. The person may have been overpowered during the original trauma and then more disempowered during the confusion and the trauma that was experienced during the psychosis, but it is possible for them to pick themselves up and go on. And many times that's the most important thing to focus on is really how they can pick themselves and up and go on. The Feeling Safe program is a CBT approach that's really had the best reported outcomes so far by far in working with people with paranoid delusions. And that they didn't focus on the past. They were just more like, well, maybe you're safe enough now. Maybe we can help you get on with your life, and did that in various ways. So collaborating and with people and figuring out how to move on with their life is one really important avenue to take with people that have been traumatized. We don't want to be just focused on the past, though, as I talked about in the last seminar, therapy that is oriented towards changing the understanding of the past and reprocessing what happened has also been found to be a helpful direction. So the idea of developing an understanding of people's story relates to the basic CBT approach of developing a formulation. Now, not all CBT for psychosis approaches rely on developing a formulation, and researchers are still trying to discern how essential it is or isn't and in what situations. But I think there's considerable evidence that can be helpful, at least much of the time. So if a formulation is a working hypothesis about a story or overview of what's going on with people, both what maybe caused the problems, what's been maintaining them. You get curious about a variety of factors that might have contributed to or be contributing to the person's problematic experiences and behaviors. And by developing a story like that, you develop both hope for change, that maybe things could be done differently, and some specific suggestions about what the person might do or try to make change happen. And if you're only working with somebody briefly, you might not have time to develop a complex formulation, but you can still develop little mini formulations and just showing curiosity about what might be going on. Like, maybe, for example, you can talk to somebody enough to notice, well, it seems like some people betrayed you, and then you tried to protect yourself by suspecting everybody, but maybe then, you went a bit overboard with that and got caught up in some paranoia, and then assuming everybody's against you, and that caused more problems. Just a little mini formulation, and then maybe they can go out and develop a better understanding later. But before I talk more about how to develop a sense of story, I want to also talk about some of the barriers to that. And one of the barriers that runs into it is the way when people are trying to avoid facing their trauma, they actually get out of get out of a whole sense of time, in a sense, because one way we protect ourselves when we're facing something horrible is just sort of like, hey, this is not happening, I'm not here. We try not to just be there with it, and then later if the memories come back, we just try to not have them. The problem with that is that if we never accept that something happened, we can't place it in time and have it get done with. We can't really frame it as a memory. Instead, when flashbacks happen, they feel like a current threat because they don't have a place in time. So, one thing we're working as we're trying to develop the story is, yeah, there was something dreadful, but it's something that already happened. It happened in the past, and actually, I lived through it, or you lived through it. So the dreadful has already happened. And then we start helping the person back to a sense of having, a possible future, because some stuff is in the past, it can be placed there, and then the present is different than that, and the future can be different yet. And this can be difficult because, some trauma can just seem like kind of like unspeakable, or just so much that people just can't face it. And so it's understandable that this leads to incoherence that's later seen as part of psychosis. One kind of graphic example had to do with this team was working with somebody who'd been psychotic for a number of years, and one of the things he would do is talk about his guts exploding, and he'd look at people and see blood coming out of their eyes, and never explained where that came from or whatever. Could have said, well, it's just a psychotic symptom. But then they talked to his family, and his family talked about how when this guy was 8 years old, he was watching his dad fix a truck, and his dad was under the truck, and the truck fell off the lift and crushed his dad. So he actually watched his dad's guts explode and blood come out of his eyes, but he just wasn't able to talk about that. And once they were able to talk about it, it was helpful, but it's just so unspeakable. Now, there's also a lot of developmental research that looks at the gradual breakdown in the ability or maybe willingness of people to tell a coherent story as they progress towards psychosis. So they've actually come up with a 3-stage model, and one of it is kind of like a focus on suffering that often emerges in childhood, often because there is real suffering, and then a disjointed structure that emerges in middle to late adolescence, and then something called detached narration that emerges before around the time of a first psychotic episode. And that detached narration is about relating facts without any sense that they add up to a coherent meaning. And it may seem that that's just, the result of a defect in someone's brain. But I'm a person who experienced a lot of trauma in childhood and then something like psychosis as a young adult, though I didn't get formally diagnosed. But I recall that when I shifted to seeing everything as meaningless and talking about it that way, it was like a kind of liberation. It helped me no longer feel trapped in the sad tales that had defined my existence. I also decided that I wasn't even the same being that experienced my childhood. I was really trying to break away from it. But the tricky thing in trying to break out of a story and refusing to be defined by the story of my life, or blasting it with dynamite in a sense, is that we need stories to organize ourselves and to not be mad. And so we need to find a way to relate to and come back to having stories, maybe new stories. And that's really what people need in their recovery. So, I think we should be helping people find the freedom to tell the story in a way that works for them. So I like the Salman Rushdie quote: "Those who do not have the power over the story that dominates their lives, the power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless." So we want to help people get creative with stories and look at it in different ways and find out ways that work for them. Of course, people with psychosis are often telling stories that don't work for them. So they're telling stories that may solve some emotional problems for them, but that cause other problems, even if they might be severe. So people may have important emotional reasons why they're telling the story the way they are, but it's to everybody else, it looks psychotic, causes all sorts of problems. So we often try to rescue them with something here I'm calling the psychiatric story, which is, well, you're just having those experiences because you have an illness. And the person themselves may feel stuck between a rock and a hard place. They may feel they have to either agree that they're sick and so not capable of telling and making sense of their own story. They have to be defined by others as mentally ill, or they might go back to sticking up for their beliefs in an inflexible and psychotic way. No, it's just the way I said it was. I'm not going to be flexible at all. Now, what we're really trying to do is help people evolve their story. Yeah, maybe some of that stuff I was saying yesterday was kind of paranoid, and some of it was kind of grandiose. But hey, I can tell my story this new way, and maybe that will work. and don't have to see myself as forever mentally ill. So it's the idea that people can evolve, and we hopefully can help them evolve. And it helps actually if we're non-dogmatic ourselves, if we're telling a story in a really fixed way. Hey, I know what's going on, and it's exactly this. We're not modeling the kind of flexibility that people need to evolve their story. Eventually, we want people to be able to come up with stories that meet their emotional needs and help them relate well with others, so their stories, are acceptable to others as well as themselves. So the general goal is, helping people form coherent narratives which cover the past and frame the present and define future possibilities. And as the slide says, has flexible capacity to integrate internal and external experience. So this is what was going on in here. It seemed to relate to what was external in this way. It makes some kind of sense, and it promotes self-worth. Now, what people usually have coming in when they see us is either they have the absence of a coherent narrative. Sometimes it's just incoherent. It can't make much sense. Or they have a narrative, but it doesn't make sense to others. So other people see it as crazy, but it doesn't really work in relating to other people. Or maybe the person has, they're more depressed and anxious, and maybe their story is just, oh, I just have this mental illness and I can't make sense of things. Um, it's been found when people have insight into their illness, as it's been called, that they tend to be more depressed. They're often telling stories that don't give them a strong sense of self-worth or hope for recovery. But what really want is to help people come up with stories that have a sense that something good can come out of bad, for example. Stories that can end in a sense of meaning and recovery, like, hey, maybe I got really confused and I was insisting on things that were, kind of like way out there, but now I have some understanding of how that happened and how to manage things better. And maybe I can go on and have some meaningful success in my life. Now, in looking at stories, a key thing I think to understand is the social side of trauma. Um, Research, for example, shows that traumatic events do much of their harm by undermining people's valued social identities. For example, one reason why rape is seen by some as an effective weapon of war is because it often shames the victim and then weakens their bonds with their family and the community. Uh, Sexual abuse, like of kids, has a similar kind of effect. And interpersonal violence and abuse also weakens social trust, which is necessary to maintain social bonds and social identity. And of course, when people are shamed to the degree they can't even talk about what happened, that's even worse. On the other hand, when people can maintain social identity through a trauma, or when that social identity can be restored afterwards, we see a lot more resilience. One interesting fact is that amongst trauma survivors, no, amongst torture survivors, those who were committed activists tended to have significantly less post-traumatic symptoms compared to those who were non-activists but just got more randomly tortured, even though the activists often were tortured more severely. And it's one understanding is that's because for the activists, the torture had a lot more meaning and it didn't undermine their social identity. In a way, they affirmed it. Hey, I'm enduring torture because I really believe in the cause and I really took a position and now I'm being tortured for it. So when we're trying to help build stories, it's important, I think, to help people both notice how some events led to a sense of disconnection and ways that they might restore or re-envision social connections. And at first, we might just be helping people see the possibility of restored connection, but then we can work to help them take the steps to actually connect. And restored connections is all about meeting with people and connecting as a peer or equal. Just having helping relationships, or especially when help is from outsiders that you don't feel culturally connected with, that tends to have people stuck in a victim role and dependent. And so if we can help people get support, like within their own cultural group or group that they feel like they fit in and they can fit into as a peer, that's what's most helpful. So if we're culturally different than the person we're helping, we might, for example, explore how they might find support within their own group and a restored sense of that they fit in. Sometimes peer groups, like hearing voices groups, can be really helpful. And those groups can even be organized in a way that's culturally specific. For example, a colleague of mine facilitates a hearing voices group just for Hasidic Jews. And again, they can connect culturally, but also connect with people who can understand the experience of hearing voices. And so have that peer sense. It's also been found that rethinking one's identity and restoring and invigorating social connections can lead to what's called post-traumatic growth. Studies do find that 30 to 80% of people who get traumatized manage to find some degree of growth like that after trauma. Well, of course, especially if they get effective treatment. But researchers are also starting to look at post-psychotic growth and finding evidence of that in many cases. But again, often the social reconnection piece is so important. So, how do we help people come back and construct a sense of story? Um, one thing is using a timeline to map out important events in a person's life can often help. And and then sometimes people can coherently tell the story of part of their life, but then other parts seem really disjointed and fragmented and don't make much sense, and often slowing down around those and getting more curious and trying to puzzle it out, maybe even having the person, if they're into it, try to write out an account and make sense of it, and then address poorly explained gaps and look at it in a few different ways. And that really helps person integrate kind of like what happened, both integrate the traumatic parts and the psychotic parts. Um, Also looking at the coping strategies that the person used at various points, and maybe how to some extent they helped cope and to some extent they made problems worse. Um, because often, people use coping that has unintended consequences, like even the one, hey, I'm going to avoid being hurt by people by withdrawing, but then you withdraw so much that you lose your social connections and don't have any friends. That's an unintended consequence. Um, so looking at the positive and negative side of coping strategies. There's, in CBT, we talk about underdeveloped versus overdeveloped coping strategies. So overdeveloped ones, the person may have done something a lot that has helped them in some ways, but then it caused them a lot more problems. So an example might be just distrusting people and being suspicious. That can actually be understood as a coping strategy. It can, for example, if we're real suspicious, we're less likely to get betrayed and taken advantage of by people. But unfortunately, if we've underdeveloped the opposite strategy of trusting people, it might keep us from accessing support when we do happen to be around trustworthy people. So it's best to have both possible strategies and then try to apply them at the appropriate time. Um, now, people often, identify, or you might say blend with one kind of extreme, while the other one is seen as an enemy or a symptom. So here's a diagram or formulation that shows how, for this one guy I was working with, toughness versus vulnerability played out for him. And it took us some months to make sense of how this was working in his life, but it was really helpful once we got there. So one of the things was, this person had definitely a lot of trauma that they experienced. And as a result of the trauma, really developed very much, or you might even say overdeveloped, the strategy of seeking to be in control and be tough. And I'm tough and stuff doesn't affect me. And, but then what happened was the person started to hear voices, and those voices would kind of like taunt him with representations of what he couldn't control and what was beyond him. And his reaction to that was that he interpreted that as a threat. Oh no, they're threatening my sense of control. I need to control them. I need to control the voices. But then what happened was that the voices actually fed off the tension, and the more he tried to control them, the more they increased. They just got worse and more predominant. And so then, as life increasingly went out of control, as his preoccupation with the voices went up, right? That made sense. And that resulted in even more trauma and kept the whole cycle going. He would just, so once we, really could grasp, okay, that's kind of like the story of what's been going on really for years. We could start imagining a recovery story that went differently. So part of a recovery story, if we could just reduce the trauma in his life, like if your client's homeless and you get them into a home, that already is going to reduce some current trauma. So that can be helpful. But then a real key thing was, instead of just focusing on toughness, what about the lesser developed strategy of accepting that we're some vulnerability, Okay, maybe vulnerability can coexist alongside toughness, and just helping my client notice that or experience that was really important. Then what changed is when voices did appear, instead of see them as this horrible threat, just accept them as clues about areas of vulnerability. Oh, the voices are pointing out ways that I am vulnerable or could be vulnerable. Okay, that's what they're doing. But interpreted that way, they're not a threat to a sense of control. So there's no need to eliminate them. They're just a reminder of, that there's things in life we can't control. We have vulnerabilities. They're just there. And then due to lack of tension around them, the person is fighting to suppress them, the voices just become less noticeable. They just aren't that important. And then because there's not that big battle with the voices going on, life becomes increasingly manageable. And that, of course, leads even more to less trauma, right? So that's, again, this took months to come up with, and then once we've discovered the virtuous circle, it wasn't like things were immediately completely fixed because he'd slip back into the old patterns, but then we could kind of like notice that he was slipping back in the old patterns and remind, hey, there's other way you could do it and understand it, and that really helped provide an alternative path forward and a possibility of recovery. To tell another story of somebody I worked with. This was was 23 years old. He'd had several psychotic breaks. Was currently experiencing a lot of paranoia, fears that the government was doing something to him, or the government was making him feel things and attack him in various ways. Interestingly, he had no recollection of childhood trauma. But here, what was, helpful in his case is that his family members came in and they had all sorts of recollections of trauma. His mom reported there'd been severe domestic violence, some of which that he'd witnessed, some of which he'd, been a victim of. And also his cousin was forthcoming enough to admit that he had sexually abused him years ago. My client didn't remember any of this, but the information came out, and so that was the situation. So then, well, how did I work with it? So a key thing I think to start off with was just being receptive to his perceptions and relate to them in a positive way while maintaining a curiosity about what might actually been going on. Like, is it really oppression by the government? Is it, and then, first just introduced as a possibility, is it possible that some of these things that you're feeling and experiencing have something to do with trauma memories emerging? And he at first saw that as a scarier alternative. In other words, it was less scary to think that the government was persecuting him and doing weird things to him with weird technology than it was to think that he was remembering horrible things from his childhood. And I think that's interesting. And I think the reason why it was more scary is part of him actually kind of like knew what it was, and knew that was the feelings of terror associated that were very real. But eventually he was able to shift to consider that point of view, and would even started becoming the dominant point of view. Like, instead of coming in and saying what the government had done to him while he was on the bus, he might come in and say, I think I was having a body memory while I was on the bus. And you could start working with it more like the way you'd work with just traditional trauma. That's still having problems, but now that you could work, they could be worked through the way, we work through trauma. And so then again, hope for a positive future emerges, and that sort of thing. So I can, talking about, people that have clear trauma histories, but what about when people are reporting stuff that, might just be as a result of their psychosis? Now, I think I mentioned in the earlier seminar that when people with psychosis report childhood trauma, it usually seems to be accurate in the sense that they compared, people with psychosis that reported childhood trauma with people that don't have psychosis that report childhood trauma. And they look back to see, well, can we corroborate this? What percent of the time can we corroborate it? And they found out it was about the same in both groups. So, but at the same time, if you work in this field long enough, you will run into people that are reporting stuff from their childhood that, this sounds clearly psychotic. And then other times where you just really don't know. It's just not clear. So one strategy can be just helping the person doing better at coping with any sense of having a memory or any intrusions, whether it's real or not, you know. So the person is having what seems like an intrusive memory of, being, tortured by people or aliens or whatever. You can help them. Well, how can we help you cope when that comes into your mind? How can we help you? Maybe simple stuff like bring yourself into the present and notice you're okay right now, or maybe it's over now, whatever did happen, um, and find ways just to accept the existence of those, whatever it is in their mind that the intrusions, and move on with their lives. So we can work on that even while keeping our doubts about whether it's something that you know actually real that they're struggling with. But another key technique can be, clarifying the actual story and looking how the person reached conclusions about it. And sometimes when you do this, you find a mix. It seems like most likely there was a mix of real trauma with stuff that maybe wasn't. And or sometimes you might just be able to come to an agreement with your client that you might not ever be able to know all about it. Like I worked with a guy who reported he was abused severely by a group of people, and that they abused him seemed real, confirmed by the fact that the same group actually abused a classmate who remembered it clearly and was not psychotic. Um, but the nature of what happened to him seemed really questionable. He recalls and there was a lot of reasons why it was confusing. Like he recalled that they drugged him and they did things to trick him and mislead him. Like at one point, he recalls being made to murder someone, yet later he found that that person was alive. And we just agreed that that maybe what some of he remembered was drug-induced hallucinations. Maybe some of it was staged tricks, like they wanted him to make him feel guilty for murdering somebody, so they staged it. Maybe some of it was even the result of something like nightmares, or it was induced by dissociative states. Um, so, so sometimes just admitting that we don't know, and sometimes what seems to be real shifts over time. Like Emma Good is a woman who's written about her experiences, so I can repeat it. And during a psychotic break she started talking about having been sexually abused. And then she came out of the psychosis and she decided, well, that was all just the psychosis, and product of my that didn't happen. Didn't seem real. But then a relative of hers disclosed having been abused by the same person, and that person had never forgotten it. And another thing they remembered is that Emma had been abused by the same person, so they knew about the abuse at the time. So, in that case, it seems pretty clear that Emma was in her psychotic episode actually remembering what was real, even though as non-psychotic, she probably didn't remember it. So it can be tricky. I want to repeat now a case example that came out of a book. It wasn't somebody I worked with, but I think it's a helpful example. So this was, coming into treatment, was a 28-year-old. She had a 6-year history of delusional disorder, but she managed her day-to-day life okay. Played in a folk band, was a university student and gender studies, had a live-in partner, but she would get hospitalized every once in a while due to delusions. And so and they looked at how the problems developed. So it seemed like often in social situations, it would stir up strong emotions. Maybe she's out playing with the folk band, and then she starts having thoughts such as, they know about my father and the IRA. And she'd get more paranoid and she'd drink more, and then her thoughts would get more carried away. And she'd start seeing complex connections between her father, the IRA, and Margaret Thatcher. And then, sometimes she'd just go home and sleep it off, and other times she'd get so distressed she'd get hospitalized. So they worked on it in two directions. One is just trying to understand, what was going on. They used a mood diary and identified the cycle of escalation. And she could see how, as her emotions got more carried away, her beliefs would get more carried away as well. They did some thought challenging work, to help her question some of the more paranoid thoughts. And that helped her to step back a little and not feed the cycle so much. Then as she became more engaged with therapy, they started, like they did develop a timeline of her life and started exploring some of the more, questionable things. Like, for example, one of her concerns was that, she wondered if her father had sexually abused her. Now, she had a very clear memory of her father sexually abusing her. But the thing was, it happened in a cave and Margaret Thatcher was watching. And it seemed real and graphic, but they explored in detail, though, her memories of that period in her life. And she was able to recall that she had experienced such a cave by the sea when she was lost by her mother for a period of time. She ended up in this cave, but that was actually on a family vacation where her father wasn't even there. You can talk with the family and figure that out. They were able to do that with a number of memories. And in the process, they also got more clear on what were the confirmed actual upsetting events in her life. Like when her parents got divorced when she was 3 years old, her father treated her less favorably than he did a half sibling. And then her father hired a babysitter who did sexually abuse her, and her dad didn't believe her. So, that kind of thing would make her, associate her dad with sexual abuse. So as they got her attention more focused on the actual upsetting events, the delusional system lost its power. That point about how delusions lose their power when we focus on the real upsetting events is something I think that we need to be aware of in treatment more generally. I was attending a presentation by Aaron Beck, and somebody brought up the frustration they were having. They were working with this guy who kept claiming he'd been baked in an oven. And the therapist had tried to point out that this guy, if you were baked in that way, you'd be dead. Your flesh would have fallen off. But that hadn't helped at all to look at it that way. So the therapist asked Beck, how would you work with this? And Beck said, well, first he'd ask the person what it was like being baked in the oven. And then once he got an answer, he'd say, well, does anything else in your life now feel like that experience of being baked in the oven? Or was there anything in the past that felt like that? And then once the person brought up those kind of concerns, he'd focus more energy on that. And Beck's idea is if you start talking about the real concern, that sucks the juice out of the delusion, is the the way he would talk about it. So different cultures have different ways of talking about how all this works. So I think it helps to open our mind to different ways of making sense. So I want to just look a little bit at a Native American approach, and I'm going to borrow a bit from my colleague, Native American psychiatrist Louis Melmadrona. Now, Louis would say that in the indigenous North American view, the self or personal identity is made of stories, or even that there's a swarm of stories around us, like a swarm of bees. Some are closer to us, some are more distant. And these are stories that have been told to us, and they're stories that arose out of our interactions and our communities. And we assemble a sense of self when we need it from these stories. And this is very much like what the psychologist Hubert Hermans calls the dialogical self, if you want a more European conceptualization of the same idea. Um, anyway, here's a few points that Lewis would make about these stories. And one is there's no bad people, only bad stories. And we can help people change from bad stories to good stories. And the more people can tell and hear good stories, the more likely they are to stick and have impact. Um, and miracles are always possible. So we don't want to succumb to the story that we or someone else is hopeless. As we put it, hope is perpetual. So just if people hear recovery stories, that can really help. If people can reshape their own story from a bad story that leaves them feeling sick and helpless to a story, again, that evolving human story that I mentioned earlier, the sense of like, yeah, maybe I made some mistakes, but hey, I'm a person who learns and I'm learning to do this more and that more. And maybe if I keep down that route, good things can happen. Um, let's see. Yeah. And so you'd also say that new stories that we are learning have to be lived within a community, which is what makes them real, manifest, and able to replace the old stories of suffering, isolation, and woe. So living in a community where we can interact as a peer. So people need not just to be in relationships with formal helpers, but find a way to connect with people where they can relate as a peer. And this is why helping people get going with positive activities is so vital to recovery. Even being listened to can be part of a big switch, a big shift. I was working with one trauma survivor, and at one point for a few days in between sessions, she slipped into a very dark place. And I was out of town at the time. And she was feeling that in order to get any attention in the world, she had to accept horrible abuse, which was actually true when she was a kid. Um, but by the time she'd made it to the therapy session, she'd already gotten out of that horrible state. So I asked her how she got out of it. And she said that in the middle of it, she heard my voice. And what I just said to her is, hey, this is Ron. I'm here. You know, but suddenly hearing that, she recalled how she could be seen and acknowledged without accepting abuse, because that's what was happening, in our weekly sessions. That's, what I was doing. So Lewis would also say, like, every story has a spirit, and every time a story is told, it has an effect on the listener. That's why I tell a lot of good stories. And the spirit of the story stays with the person and continues, even after the storyteller has departed. Also cautions against don't telling bad stories, so really try to, some people report coming to that mental health system and just being told you're always going to be mentally ill, give up on your former hopes and dreams. Those are really bad stories. One way Lewis would help people have access to better stories would be to tell traditional mythic stories from native culture about how obstacles were overcome. But he'd also help people revise the way they looked at and told their own stories. One example was a woman who came to a healing retreat that he was involved in. And this was a woman who'd experienced terrible sexual and physical abuse. And then she'd been psychotic for many years with multiple hospitalizations. When she showed up, at first, she wouldn't get out of her car. So Lewis just talked to her through the window. But eventually she got out and they started doing some prayer and healing ceremonies. And at some point in that, Lewis, the psychiatrist, he heard a voice. And the voice said, "Give her a medal." And that sounds bad, a psychiatrist hearing command hallucinations, but actually Lewis always had that kind of thing. He said it wasn't until he went off to graduate school that he found out that not everyone hears voices, because it was common in his culture. But anyway, he told her he wanted to give her a medal, and she was shocked. But he pointed out that in her story, she'd often accepted abuse so that her siblings would not have to endure it. And he said she needed something like a version of a Purple Heart. And getting that award was one thing that helped her heal, but they also worked with her a lot more over a 4-year period. But then he checked back with her 20 years later, and she's doing great. So, so anyway, I hope what I've said today will help you get better at telling good stories, helping people fashion good stories for themselves. And now I think we can open it to question and answer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ron. We actually have two questions. The first is, would you be willing to make your slides available for sharing to our participants today?
Oh, yes, certainly.
Fantastic. And the second is, what about auditory hallucinations? How would you use the same intervention to respond to those?
Well, for example, I used the experience of Eleanor Longden, who had a real crime. That was a big part of it. And at first she thought of the voices as belonging to entities outside of her, and really this horrible thing she had to get rid of. But as she played around with different understandings, like she first learned to think, well, maybe they're not really outside of me. They threatened to kill her whole family one night, and she stayed up guarding it. And when they didn't show up, she realized, hey, they're scamming me. They're not really outside. But then she started connecting. Well, maybe these voices are here because of all that stuff I buried, and that they're a manifestation of that. Like I said, how she buried it alive, and now it's coming back at her in the form of voices. I mentioned the other client who tried to just be strong and tough, but then the voices reminded him of his vulnerability. And then his first impression, I gotta suppress that, because again, it was like, I just have to be tough. I can't have any vulnerability. But when he learned to accept, oh yeah, we're all have vulnerability. That's part of being human. The voices remind me of that. That's not a big problem. Now all of a sudden he could relate to those voices differently. So that's a couple examples at least.
I appreciate that discussion, and it sounds like a real synthesis of taking some of the cognitive restructuring approaches, right? If folks can do that, that's fantastic. But sometimes there may be some more acceptance-based approaches. The voice is here. I don't have to listen to it. I don't have to obey it. It just kind of is.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to think of like so part of it is acceptance, and then also part of it curiosity, what might be
Mhm.
underneath it. Is important, because again, when you can get to the real issue of what's underneath it, it's like Beck says, that sucks the juice out of the delusion, but it also, you know it sucks the controversy out of the voice. Like the guy was battling with the voice about his vulnerability, but when he realized the real issue is, hey, I'm a vulnerable human being and I haven't been able to accept it, well, now he had something to focus on that was much deeper than the voices, um, and that ultimately helped him go on with his life.
Excellent. We have another question. How do you work with people who are severely mentally ill, violent, and it's a struggle to develop a positive narrative?
Yeah, it definitely can be a struggle, especially when people have like really truly horrible mistakes that they have to, like maybe they killed a parent. I mean, there can be really totally horrible stuff, and obviously just acknowledge the horror of that, but also that it happened out of a state of confusion. It's like, just like if somebody has really poor vision while they're driving and they run over a kid, it's a totally horrible thing, but they might, later, well, this stuff, there was a story to how that happened. Why were they unable to see? What made them think that a kid wasn't there? And some of it might have been mistakes, but there's a story to how that mistake happened. And that helps them consider, like, hey, I can never change my past. This horrible thing will always be part of my past, but I can become a person who's conscientious. Like if I continue to drive, I can, drive in a much safer manner. And that's what you would want to be helping the person who killed somebody do.
Another question is, what are your thoughts on the use of ritual to help shift a story about psychosis/trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely can, especially if it's meaningful to the person. Like my example with Louis Almadrona and the healing ceremony they were doing, he was definitely finding it helpful. And and he brought in the component of giving her a medal, which is, I guess, probably not the usual native thing, but in this case it fit. But yeah, so I definitely would endorse that, especially if it fits for the person's culture.
Any other questions from our participants today for Mr. Ungo? It doesn't look like we're getting any more questions right now. I will drop the link to the post-webinar survey in the chat again for attendees if you'd like to fill that out for us. We would really appreciate it today. And as I said at the beginning, our recording will be available on the Community and State Hospital section YouTube account following this presentation. The link to the previous recording from last month's webinar is also located there. And the link for next month's will be there after that presentation. I guess in our lab, we've got a couple more minutes. Any other questions? Oh, I see one. I anticipate meeting strong resistance from providers to hearing the circularity of, quote, schizophrenia and other psychiatric diagnoses. Ideas of how to navigate that. It's a great question.
Yeah. Like, except that, it's just like I mentioned hypertension and high blood pressure. I mean, you can still accept, well, the name, that gets applied is hypertension, but just be curious. Let's really get interested and curious about all the factors that might go into that. So you don't have to question like do battle with the diagnosis, but it's like not using it as an explanation so much and being curious. Well, maybe, we can identify some of the factors that led to that happening. And then, so it's like, it's like digging under it, it's not battling with the diagnosis, but digging under it. What's underneath this? What's behind it? How'd this come to be? It's like you might with hypertension. What are all the factors that might have contributed? Diet, exercise, stress, those things. So it becomes more than just taking a pill. Well, pills can obviously have an effect, but there can be more to it.
Any other last questions? We did get a few comments saying this was phenomenal and thanking you for your insight and for all of the information that you provided. So excellent.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, if any, my email is on the slides, and you'll be sending out the slides. So if somebody has a follow-up question or something like that, feel free to email me. That's fine.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Ron. Yes, we're getting a lot of comments in now saying thank you so much. They're looking forward to part 3. So we appreciate you so much. And yes, I can actually drop your email in the chat as well, just since your slides are no longer up, in case anyone didn't get a chance to view that and wants to reach out to you later. Oh, I see a hand raised. Let's see. Sandra Fleming. How do let me see if I can get to her.
So somebody's asking in the chat if it was difficult to get family members to give their side of the story. Not in my experience. So I definitely hear from some therapists that sometimes it takes a long time and they only come out really slow. And actually, there's cases of mine where it's come out really slow. One, it was somebody I kept remembering they had a broken leg when they were a kid, but they're always told they never had any broken bones. But they persisted in asking. And finally, somebody in the family, yeah, your dad kicked you when you were 3, but we didn't want you to think of your dad that way. So.
Oh, and then it looks like we've got someone with their hand up. So Mary, I'm going to unmute you now. Is that who has their hand up? No, yes.
Mary, if you can also unmute yourself, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe that was an accident. Let's see. I don't see anyone else's hand up. Okay, see if we've got any other questions. Doesn't look like it. Well, thank you again so much, Ron. Thank you for everyone for attending today. And stay posted. Our next webinar will be on Friday, April 21st from noon to 1 Central Time for part 3 of this exciting webinar series.
Yeah, thank you for all your work in organizing this and making it happen. I know there's a lot to it.
Of course, of course. Well, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their Friday.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.